much. It's wonderful to be here tonight, and anytime I get a welcome like that one, I'm reminded that I'm not in Washington, and that is always a good thing. You know, I've learned a few rules in life, some of them from The Princess Bride. Never fight a land war in Asia. Never engage in a battle of the wits with the Sicilian when death is on the line. Never, ever give a speech about federalism, separation of powers, and judicial supremacy immediately following the world's greatest satirist. But I'm actually honored and thrilled to be able to follow him because his remarks are so appropriate and fit right into what I have to say. In fact, my wife, Sharon, say hello to everybody, Sharon. Sharon is my wife of 29 years, the mother of my 3 children, my best friend, my high school sweetheart, and the source of most of my good ideas. If you ever hear me say anything remotely profound, it most certainly came from Sharon in the first instance. It's also an honor to be here among some of my Utah friends, including Gail and Don Razika. Gail, if you don't know her, you need to get to know her. She is a freedom ninja and an absolute inspiration to us all. She keeps me on the straight and narrow, so thank you. Sharon and I were talking just before we got up here, and she reminded me that it was actually satire that brought down a significant era of political corruption in the United States. Tammany Hall. Tammany Hall and the model on which it was built was diabolical. It was intractable. It was impossible to eliminate. Modern historians have incorrectly credited big government in Washington, with taking down systems like Tammany Hall. Nonsense. Had nothing to do with New Deal-type programs. It had everything to do with Christian women who united together and with the help of satirists who depicted what was happening with Tammany Hall in the form of cartoons. They took it down. That's what brought us to a better place in America. And satire will work again. We have to remember a few things about ourselves, about human nature, in order to understand how we operate in government. We are all subject to an all-knowing, wise, loving Creator. That Creator understands us as having infinite worth and eternal souls. He wants us to live in freedom and be happy. He wants freedom for us, not just because it sounds nice when you shout freedom in front of a crowd, or not just because we all tear up when we watch William Wallace shout freedom on Braveheart, such a good show, but because of the good things that free people do when they are allowed to be free. An all-knowing, loving God, even the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, rejoices in our freedom because it's His will that we be able to make our own choices and not have them thrust upon us by others. It brings Him happiness and joy when we are free, and so we must be free. He wants us to govern ourselves, because when we govern ourselves, it is an acknowledgement that God is our governor and none else. That's why we cling to freedom, and that is why the left hates self-government and will do everything in its power to undermine it. It's not a rejection of freedom so much as it is a rejection of God, and we therefore reject their sad, gloomy, dismal message. I want to tell you a little bit about how I became interested in the Supreme Court, about what got me interested in government and politics generally. I stumbled into this somewhat by accident at the age of 10. Very normal story. It's how everyone stumbles into it. My late father, his name was Rex Lee, was a professor of law. He was the founding dean of Brigham Young University's law school. He also served as President Ronald Reagan's Solicitor General. The Solicitor General is the administration's chief legal advocate before the U.S. Supreme Court. When he got that job, and just as we had moved across the country to suburban Washington, D.C., one day he was explaining to me, his job that he was starting and how it worked. And somehow the subject of Roe versus Wade came up. He asked if I knew what that was, and I said, I don't know what it is. Why don't you describe it to me? I was incredulous at the thought that somebody would go to all the trouble of coming up with a Supreme Court opinion in order to kill babies. That was repugnant to me in any way. But then I asked a few questions. I asked my dad, number one, why is this a federal issue rather than a state one, given that there's obviously nothing in the Constitution that makes this federal? Number two, if it were federal, why would it not be a legislative issue, and why would it be a judicial one? Tears of hot tears of joy welled up in my father's eyes, and from that moment forward, I knew that although he had 7 children, I was the favorite. Not many months after that, my father was working on a brief in a case called City of Akron versus Akron Center for Reproductive Health. In that case, the Solicitor General of the United States was taking a position as a friend of the court, an amicus curiae brief, defending some legitimate health and safety restrictions on abortion clinics in Ohio. He was defending those, saying, notwithstanding Roe versus Wade, even with Roe versus Wade, the court should still defer to findings as to health and safety regulations by a state. And states and their political subdivisions, like cities, ought to receive deference in their finding of what does and does not amount to an intrusion into this right that the Supreme Court has itself put together. Now, the left didn't like that very much. And so one morning, I was eating my frosted mini wheats like any 11-year-old would at the time. We're watching Saturday morning cartoons. My parents were out running errands. My siblings were all with them. And as an 11-year-old boy, there was nothing better than being at home alone on a Saturday morning so that you could decide which cartoons you wanted to watch and which you didn't. I looked out the window of my parents' home, and I saw a mysterious, odd sight. A large Greyhound bus pulled into our neighborhood and stopped right in front of our house. Now, this is a quiet suburban neighborhood in suburban Washington, D.C. And all these people started stepping out, and they were carrying signs, and they were chanting things. I couldn't quite hear them, but I knew something was terribly wrong. Now, the movie Home Alone wouldn't come out for another 10 years. I have thought about suing Warner Brothers for name, image, likeness, and story theft because they pretty much stole my story. I immediately started thinking, I've got to defend the home. I went through my arsenal of options. I had the illegal fireworks stash that my cousins had bought on the Indian reservation the year before. The lawnmower with the bagger removed, there was great possibility with that one. The sprinklers, the hose, all sorts of things. I was just about ready to go to defend my home, and then all of a sudden I realized, wait, that could invite press. The press, I could be on TV, the police will show up. That wouldn't be nice to my dad, so I better not do that. So I did what any 11-year-old would do at that point. I went outside to decide to talk to them. So I identified the person who appeared to be in charge. This very tall, muscular woman, we'll call her Karen. I went up to Karen. Don't know whether that was in fact her name, but I'm pretty sure it had to have been. No offense if there are any Karens out there. I said, hi, I live here. What's your name and why are you here? Now, this is a note to self, people. If you're ever protesting at the home of a public official, please don't do that, by the way. It's dangerous because it sends a signal. The signal is, to the public official, we know where you live, we know where you sleep, we know where your children sleep and where you are most vulnerable, and we will harm you. Do you want to know what her first words to me were? Hello, little boy, we're not here to hurt you. Don't ever say that to a kid. Because you're revealing what you're thinking, which is we're here to threaten harm to you and your family. And so I said, okay, you're not here to harm me. Well, what are you here to do? She said in the most condescending tone imaginable, well, little boy, we're here because we disagree with some of the things that your daddy is saying in the Supreme Court. Now, I knew more or less what she was talking about, and I said, I understand that. You disagree with them. It doesn't explain why you're on my property, why you're on my lawn. Why do you have to do this on my lawn? And she said, well, little boy, we're trying very hard not to step on the grass. I'm sure you and your friends do lots of things on the lawn. We're staying within the sidewalk and not stepping on the grass. And I thought, look, lady, this is not about the curtilage and whether or not you're operating within an easement. That's not the point here. The great part of the story was, after 2 or 3 hours went by, they got bored because my dad wasn't there to have the confrontation. My parents were running errands. My siblings were all away doing something else. My brother was at a basketball game. And so they got in their bus and they left they went home. Just as they were pulling out of the neighborhood, my parents pulled into the neighborhood. My dad drove up the driveway, and he said to me, "Michael, there was a Greyhound bus leaving the neighborhood. Do you have any idea what that was about?" And I said, boy, do I ever. That's what got me interested in the law. That's what got me interested in the Constitution. That's what made me, at the beginning, a pro-life American, was because I understood people had manipulated the courts and the Constitution in a most dastardly way. They had done it in a way that would undermine the very purpose of the Constitution. This document, written by the hands of wise men, raised up by Almighty God to that very purpose, a God who understands your eternal significance, your infinite worth, wants you to live in freedom so that you're not in bondage one to another, so that you can choose, and you can choose Him, and you can return to Him, and we can live in peace in this lifetime as we prepare to meet Him in the next life. Those are the men who wrote this, raised up by that same God so that we could be free. They took that same thing that was designed to protect life and liberty and property, all the essential ingredients of the pursuit of happiness, and they turned it into a weapon of death. How did we get there? And how do we avoid allowing that to be turned against us? Well, that's why I wrote Saving Nine. It has a lot to do with that. In Saving Nine, I tell the story of the Supreme Court. I explain why it is that the Supreme Court exists and what its purpose is, what it is and what it isn't. It's just there to resolve disputes. You know, the Constitution has these structural protections in it. One of them is vertical. We call that federalism. The other is horizontal. We call it separation of powers. The powers of the federal government are limited and narrow, just a few of them. Within the federal government, which is narrow, we're going to have one branch that makes the laws. That's my branch, the legislative branch. You've got the executive branch that enforces the laws, or in theory, it's supposed to. Then you've got the judicial branch that has the narrowest, least dangerous job of all, which is just to interpret the law, what's already been said by the legislature, when people disagree as to its meaning. As long as we keep each level of government within its proper sphere, versus, state versus local and federal, and whenever all three branches within the federal government operate within their sphere, everything works well. In fact, it's worked phenomenally well. It's helped foster the development of the greatest civilization the world has ever known. It's not just the greatest civilization. It is that too. The greatest economy and the greatest military. It's that too. It's the most upwardly mobile civilization the world has ever known. This system, which has helped foster and nurture and inculcate robust institutions of civil society and free markets, those have lifted more people out of poverty and ignorance than any government program ever could or ever will. That's why it's worth hanging on to. That's also why the enemies of self-government, even the enemies of God Himself, hate the Constitution and will do what they can to undermine it. Now, the courts, the Supreme Court, the head of the federal judicial system, although it's the least dangerous branch because it's the least powerful branch, it's also the linchpin. Think of a Roman arch. The keystone in that arch isn't weight-bearing. It's not there holding up the weight of all of it. But if you remove it, everything else crumbles. That is how the federal judiciary is best understood. It's like the plug in your boat. It's a small part, one of the smallest parts on the whole boat. If you take that out, your ship is going to sink. That's the federal judiciary. That is why I wrote this book, because there is in the Star Wars movies, there's always a flaw. There was a flaw in the Death Star, those darn ventilation systems in the Death Star. You fly your TIE fighter or whatever that thing was down there, and you can shoot in there. Luke Skywalker goes in there, and he takes his, what do you call those? Not the TIE fighter, but it's yes, X-Wing. Thank you. Thank you, Seth. Who said you're only good for satire? You fly your X-Wing down there, you get to that little exhaust ventilation system, and you lob that shot right down there, it blows the whole thing up. That's court packing. That is the weakness within the keystone. That's how they get there. Because it's not technically unconstitutional to manipulate the size of the Supreme Court by statute. There's nothing in the Constitution that actually requires that the justices consist of a body of 9. We got there somewhat by accident over time through trial and error, but it's been set that way for 153 years, and it has worked. Because it has worked, we should never depart from it. We should certainly never depart from it in the absence of some compelling need based on a human resources standpoint or something like that. Even still, I would suggest we should never move it, which is why I support the constitutional amendment that my friend Roman can tell you more about. The constitutional amendment introduced by Ted Cruz, it was actually originally introduced in a different form in 1953, to freeze the size of the Supreme Court by constitutional amendment at 9. Because this right here is the Constitution's weakness. By a simple statute, they can change the number. Once you change the number of justices, you can, through unscrupulous jurisprudence, you can manipulate the Constitution itself. You can redefine it so that it says something that it actually doesn't say. So you can have a piece of legislation that is at once totally constitutional and yet anti-constitutional. Not unconstitutional, but anti-constitutional, and it will undermine the entire thing. This is why they want to get there. And I started writing Saving Nine when I started seeing the likelihood, in fact, the inevitability, that the Supreme Court would grant certiorari, would grant review in the Dobbs case or another case like it. And that inevitably they would conclude, like every other sane person that's ever looked at it, that there is nothing in the Constitution that makes killing a baby a constitutional right, and therefore something that no state or government has the power to protect. That's really evil, what they did. When we look back at the last time court packing was undertaken in any serious endeavor, it was in 1937. In 1937, now around the Senate, I can just ask most of my colleagues, what was it like back in 1937? Most of them can tell me. One time a few years ago, when we were talking about the last time that the Senate of a different political party than the president had during a presidential election year filled the vacancy of a Supreme Court justice left that became open during that same presidential election year. Somebody said, well, it was Grover Cleveland, during Grover Cleveland's presidency. John McCain, who was with us at the time, said, oh, heck of a guy, loved him. So 1937, Franklin D. Roosevelt was on the throne, or as he perceived it. Franklin D. Roosevelt was at the end of his first term in office and about to begin his second term of office. He was tired of getting smacked down by the Supreme Court because he tried to revolutionize the size, scope, reach, and cost of the federal government. He wanted the federal government to be in charge of basically everything. Prior to that time, under the Constitution itself, the federal government's in charge of just a few things: national defense, trademarks, copyrights, and patents, weights and measures, bankruptcy laws, immigration laws. Don't tell Joe Biden, he doesn't know. Regulating trade or commerce between the states with foreign nations and with the Indian tribes. And then there's my favorite power of Congress, the one that we don't talk about much, but we should, the power to grant letters of marque and reprisal. Letters of marque and reprisal. Remember, that's the marque that's spelled M-A-R-Q-U-E. I've got a staffer named Mark. I sometimes ask him if we can spell his name M-A-R-Q-U-E, just for fun. Letters of marque and reprisal, they're a hall pass issued by Congress in the name of the United States that entitles the person holding the letter of marque and reprisal to engage in state-sponsored acts of piracy on the high seas with utter impunity in the name of the United States government. How cool is that? I don't know how long I'll serve in the United States Senate. My opponent, Evan McMullen, who appears to be within 2 or 3 points of beating me, a real lovely man, Evan McMullen, but that's a different story. He hopes that'll be a short period of time. But regardless of how long I'm in the United States Senate, I'm going to get a letter of marque and reprisal, and I'm going to be a pirate, and you are all invited to join me. Okay, Back to Franklin D. Roosevelt. He was upset because he had the perfect opening to make himself the hero of the story. He had the villain being the Great Depression. And he was going to be the hero that brought us out of the Great Depression. The only problem was the Constitution was in his way, because the Constitution limited his authority to regulate every aspect of human existence and thereby claim the credit. He got creative, and he started arguing, well, but the Commerce Clause allows us to do that. And the Supreme Court said, no, it doesn't. The Commerce Clause gives you, through the federal government, the power to regulate things and persons moving in interstate commerce, across interstate lines, interstate commercial transactions. I'm making widgets, say, in Virginia, and Gale buys them from Utah. I ship that to Gale, and that's an interstate commercial transaction. Or to regulate channels and instrumentalities of interstate commerce, interstate airways, airwaves, waterways, canals, and so forth. And that's it. But Roosevelt said, no, 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 I should be able to regulate all economic activity because it affects interstate commerce everywhere, and everything affects everything else. And if I can't regulate some commercial things, I can't regulate any commercial things, and I have to be able to do that. The Supreme Court said, sorry, no, no can do, you can't do that. He was furious with the Supreme Court. He was irate, and I'm so proud of the fact that there were these 4 justices who were always at the center of saying no to FDR. They were usually joined by 1 or more, sometimes all of the other justices, but it was the same 4 always at the center of the opposition to what FDR wanted to do. One of them, the most awesome among them, was a guy named George Sutherland. George Sutherland was a Utah, a former U.S. Senator from Utah who became a Supreme Court justice. And FDR named these guys the 4 horsemen, after the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. He hated them. And he vowed that if he won re-election in the fall of '36, that he would take them down. So after he won, he trotted out this plan: I'm going to pack the Supreme Court and I will show them and I will overcome them. And so he did. He introduced legislation that would allow him to appoint new justices so that he could put as many as 15 people on the Supreme Court, so as to silence the 4 horsemen and threaten, intimidate, and harass them. They held their own. Tragically, the Supreme Court did the work for him. The Supreme Court panicked. And on April 12, 1937, as FDR's court packing plan was still moving its way through Congress, with its lead sponsor in the Senate being Arkansas Senator Joe Robinson, who also happened to be the Senate Majority Leader at the time, it wasn't doing that well, and FDR was panicked. But the Supreme Court came to his rescue because Associate Justice Owen Roberts, who had traditionally voted with the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, switched his vote in one case. And on April 12, 1937, the Supreme Court issued a ruling in a case called NLRB versus Jones and Laughlin Steel Company. In that case, the Supreme Court redefined the Commerce Clause to give Congress the power to regulate any and every activity that, when measured in the aggregate, substantially affects interstate commerce. So all of a sudden, Congress and the federal government could regulate labor, manufacturing, agriculture, mining, anything that's economic in nature at all could be regulated by the federal government. And so this was a heyday. Now, had this been an actual constitutional amendment, number one, it could never have been ratified because it would have been wildly unpopular. Number two, had it been ratified, it would have been among the 2 or 3 most impactful constitutional amendments ever adopted because it fundamentally changed the way we do business in America, the relationship between the states and the federal government and the people. It's the reason, by the way, why most of our laws today tend to be federal rather than state. Most of our federal laws today tend to be made not by elected lawmakers, as the Constitution requires, but by unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats. Because all of a sudden, members of Congress, newly empowered with the power to regulate all things that affect interstate commerce, couldn't keep up with the workload. And more importantly, they couldn't handle the heat that comes with making law. So instead of making actual law, let me tell you what they do now and what they've been doing in the 85 years since that awful case was decided. And this is not much of an exaggeration, only a little bit. They'll pass a law that says, we shall have safe workplaces in America. And that's it, except for the fine print. And the only fine print is, and we hereby delegate to OSHA the power to make and interpret and enforce federal law deciding what a safe workplace is. Now, most of those people don't vote against the law that says we shall have safe workplaces, because if you do that, you're a monster. You're a demon. You want unsafe workplaces, and you're due to be canceled. And so they vote for it. But the next thing they know, OSHA's issuing a new rule, a new law that says if you have more than 99 employees, you will be fined. For every worker who is not vaccinated for COVID-19, you'll be fined $15,000 per person per day. There's not a business enterprise in the world that could afford to face that. There's an outrage. People cry up about it. They're freaking out. They're writing, making angry calls to their lawmakers, to their senators and congressmen. You know what they hear from the senators and congressmen? They hear, yeah, I'm angry about this. Do you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to write them a harshly worded letter. As if that were our job as lawmakers, to write harshly worded letters. My point is this: the court packing plan ultimately failed. And it failed in part because the Supreme Court did the dirty work for FDR. It became unnecessary because the Supreme Court justices were intimidated, one enough that he changed the Constitution forever. Once that happened, it set in motion this sequence of events that has led us to have a $31 trillion debt. Led most Americans to the point that they work months out of every year just to pay their federal taxes, and facing over $2 trillion in regulatory compliance costs at the federal level alone every single year. Even when court packing plans fail, they have an intended effect, and sometimes they do irreparable harm to the Constitution. That's why we can't let them happen. So we must oppose them with everything in us, every single time. By the way, in thinking about this, all this, I do have to express gratitude for what has happened within the Supreme Court in recent years. Just as the court's done bad things through bad presidents appointing them, they've also done good things. Think about where we are. Our entire lives, I was born in 1971, Sharon was born in 1973, the same year that Roe versus Wade was decided. Our entire lifetimes, we've hoped, we've dreamed, we've prayed for the moment when we could celebrate as we do today, that Roe versus Wade is no more. And for that, we do have to thank President Trump. You know, President Trump and I got off to a rocky start, 2016. I didn't know what to make of him. I didn't like how he treated some of my friends who were running for president. By some of my friends running for president, I mean all of them. And by all of them, I mean literally every member of the United States Senate was running for president at the time. They say every senator looks in the mirror and sees a future president. I'm literally the only one that doesn't have that reaction. It doesn't happen. So at the end of that, you know, after he got elected, and he and I, having gotten off to a rocky start, I was encouraged to go talk to him and had a good chat with him in Trump Tower before he was installed as president, before he took the oath of office. He, you know, made his displeasure known to me for a while, sort of yelled at me for a while, and I nodded. I said, I understand. And this went on for 10 or 15 minutes, and I nodded, doing my Mormon missionary thing. I sense you have a concern. The yelling continued, and after a while, I thought, okay, a different strategy is necessary. So I said, all right, look, I get it. I get it. I was a jerk. You're mad at me. You have every right to be mad at me. I'd be mad at me, too, if I were you. But let me just set this straight. Insofar as you fight to protect constitutionally limited government, to restore the vertical protection of federalism and the horizontal protection of separation of powers, you will have no greater friend in the Senate. You will have no stronger ally. I will fight tooth and nail alongside you, with you, for you. And insofar as you fight to undermine any one of these ever, I will be a thorn in your side, a pain in your neck. You will wish I were never born. For whatever reason, this was the right thing to say to Donald Trump. Literally from that second forward, Donald Trump and I have never had a cross word together, ever. Even when I didn't vote the way he wanted me to vote, because he appreciated what I said. He and I actually became great friends, and I proudly supported him and campaigned for him in 2020. And I miss him. I really do. I remember going over to the White House. The White House was so much more fun with him. I'd go over there, never knew what was going to happen. I'd go over to meet with Pat Cipollone about a law issue, and then Robert O'Brien, the national security advisor, would come in at some point. Donald Trump, Mike, I heard you were here. Come by the Oval. Let's chat. There was one day, maybe in May of 2020, I was over there, and it started out the same way. I was in Robert O'Brien's office. Mark Meadows came by. Hey, the president wants to see you. Come over to the Oval. I went in there. We talked about 15 or 20 different issues. My head would spin by the end of this. We'd go from the Supreme Court to foreign trade to tariffs to tax rates to Mitch McConnell to Mitt Romney. At every point, he'd ask me a question about Mitt Romney. Totally different story. I won't go down that tangent. What do you think of Mitt Romney? And then, I kid you not, so at this very time, we had been frustrated that Donald Trump had been unable to get some of his executive branch nominees through the Senate. There was a big logjam. I had been advising Mitch McConnell on how to get them through faster since Donald Trump first took office. Alas, he didn't listen to me, didn't agree with me on that one. It didn't quite work out the way that it should have. And I've been thinking about all the ways that we could make it easier for them to get them through. It's a parlor game I play with my staff. We started thinking through all these hypotheticals of what it would take to trigger a recess, a legitimate recess, so that he could make recess appointments just, for fun. And we had never told anyone about this because it was like really complicated stuff. And as if he could read my mind, this particular day he goes, Mike, what would it take if we wanted to trigger, how could we trigger a recess so that I could adjourn the Congress and then while they're adjourned, I could make recess appointments? And could we trigger all of that by objecting to a live UC request based on the absence of a constitutional quorum through a live quorum call? And I thought, oh my gosh, this guy's reading my mind. He all of a sudden transformed from Donald Trump into some constitutional tech wizard. I couldn't believe he was asking this. And I said, Mr. President, I've actually given a lot of thought to this. And as far as the precise sequence of how it would work, it would take me 4 or 5 hours with a handful of lawyers and experts in the Senate rules. And I thought that would be enough to set it aside. No. That's fine. I could wait 3 or 4 hours, go talk to Johnny. So I went and met with Johnny McEntee, the head of the Office of Presidential Personnel, and I got the right people on the phone and some of Johnny's staff, 3 or 4 lawyers and Senate rules experts. We got this whole thing figured out. It took us 4 or 5 hours. And we had to lay it out in like a 10 or 15 step process because this is all playing with fire. This is stuff that could tie the Senate almost permanently into a pretzel. But it was fantastic. I live for this stuff. And I couldn't believe he was asking me the question. So I lined it all up. And I said, okay, Johnny, 15 steps. You've got it. I'm going home. It's dark. I'm going to bed. And Johnny got cold feet. And they said, no, I'm not. You have to do this. I will mess it up. So he made me go back to the Oval Office and explain to the president. I said, fine, let's get it over with because I'm hungry. So I went in there. I thought he would have gotten bored by then and, hung it up for the day. But no, he saw me coming. Mike, did you figure it out? And I said, yes, it'll take me a minute. And so he started convening everybody. Pence, get in here. Meadows, and Kellyanne. He called them all in. So I had this kind of audience. Go ahead, Mike, explain. So I explained 10 or 15 points, and it was complicated stuff. I said, this is strong medicine. I don't know if you want to do this, but here's how it would work. And I outlined it for him with a bow on top, and I thought he would sit back and thank me. And he would say, I'm so grateful. It's really kind of you to figure it out. We'll take it under advisement. Instead, he leans back and he goes, Mike, when the rest of us were 16, we were out chasing girls, doing crazy stuff. And then I picture you. And you're not doing that, Mike. No, you're at home. You're at home studying the Constitution and the Senate rules. Am I right? And I said, well, Mr. President, as you know, I met Sharon in high school, and I loved girls in high school, especially that girl, and I married her. But yeah, you're not far off. I was doing that. His reaction was classic. He goes, I knew it. And then he looks up at his staff and the vice president assembled, and he goes, I knew it. And yet, he's got a beautiful wife. I don't know how he did it. Oh, I miss that man. So, look, just note to self, never fight a land war in Asia. Don't engage in that battle of the wits with a Sicilian when death is on the line. And never, ever pack the Supreme Court. Never flirt with it. It's not cute. It's not funny. There is never a good reason to pack the Supreme Court of the United States. We must oppose this with everything in us. Because, thank you. Because this document is about self-government. And self-government is how we remind our Maker that He is our governor. We're subject to Him. We're subject to Him because He loves us, He knows us, He's aware of us. And He's aware of the warnings that have been provided for thousands of years to human beings. Remember the warnings provided in 1 Samuel chapter 8 to the people of Israel as they wanted a king to make them fight their battles, a king who would make them great like unto other nations, a king who would make them popular and fashionable like other nations. The Lord, through the prophet Samuel, warned him, it's not what you want. The king will take your sons and send them off to war. He'll take your daughters and make them his maids. He'll take your flocks and your herds and use them to feed his armies. He will take your horses and he will ride them into battle. Don't do this. Ladies and gentlemen, that was a warning, not just about monarchs. That was a warning about governments. This is the antidote to that. Let's stick to the antidote. Thank you very much.